When I first started writing this essay, I had no idea it was going to be as long as it was, but the number of topics and concepts that are addressed in this video is invaluable information for anybody who is interested in the studies of broader capitalist political economy. A word of caution now, a great deal of the content discussed in this video will be rather dry. If I were you, I'd grab a snack if you plan on giving this your undivided attention. Otherwise, let the audio play in the background while you're running errands or doing something else. And with that being said, let's get started. Society is comprised of a series of institutions: religious institutions, educational institutions, corporate, government, financial, commercial, you name it. The way things are structured in the broader world come in the form of colleges of people coming together to fulfill a common goal, structured authoritatively, typically towards the material interests of those up top. Of course, everybody is in it for themselves, on one hand, while also participating as a cog in the broader wheel, on the other hand. Societies, no matter how large or small, adhere to this rule, from the sparsest bands of hunter-gatherer tribals to modern countries comprising millions of people. We are all plugged into a system, and one way or another we are forced to conform to that system, reinforcing it on one hand and perpetuating our own subjugation on the other. But unlike communist society, which is structured in such a way as to meet human need, maximize human happiness and participation, and realize self-actualization for as many people as possible, in the world today, and the eras long past, in this kind of prehistory we still currently occupy, society is not organized in this fashion. Instead, if human happiness and need is met in the current era, it is a side effect, not the general goal of current civilization. As a result, more oftentimes than not, we face a kind of oppression of sorts, where the work that we do is not done for our own self-fulfillment or to make society a better place, but because the work that we do is done to enrich those who hold large swaths of capital, and we have to work or face destitution. In this way, the present stage of labor is but drudgery, toil, labor that is alien to us and pertains nothing to our individual talents or creativity. Society, as it has existed for thousands of years up to this day, has been structured as to benefit a few at the expense of the many. Some of us are aware of this fact, many are not, and as such, the masses of wealth created by society are not controlled and enjoyed by the whole, but only by some, a minority who have robbed the wealth of the people through every form of exploitation of the note, via rent, interest, dividends, wage labor, intellectual property, advertising, slavery, serfdom, etc. For thousands of years we have wasted our lives toiling to perpetuate the profligate way of life of a few, when we all could be sharing in the fruits of our creation. So then why don't we rebel? After all, when the masses rise up and stand in solidarity with one another, we have a habit of winning historically. People seem relatively aware of the cruelty and inhumanity of the system. What could be the reason why the masses don't rise up, overthrow the ruling class, and establish a humane socialist society? The answer to that question is one word: hegemony. It is the way in which the ruling class maintains its grip on society, the way it perpetuates the institutions of dominance that hold us back as a species, these very same institutions, mind you, that we must participate in and submit to if we wish to survive in any meaningful capacity in this system. Today we shall discuss a modern theory of hegemony, or the hegemonic superstructure of the capitalist system that it uses to reproduce itself. There are four aspects of this hegemony as outlined by the following graph, scaling from more direct control to less direct control, from in-your-face oppression to the less obvious forms of oppression. Today we shall talk about it all. The most obvious form of control that the system exerts are the organs of state repression. That is, military, the police, the deep state institutions that act as the higher functioning apparatuses of capital. This form of repression is most obvious and goes back thousands of years. Groups of armed men in service to the ruling class to enforce and protect property rights, as well as to keep the broader masses in line by the edge of the sword. It is this apparatus that ultimately gets us all to conform to the law of the land, for if you do not pay your mortgage, they will seize your house. If you do not pay your taxes, you will go to jail. Of course, billionaires and corporations get away with not paying their taxes all the time. And how many times do you hear about underground pedophile rings which go unpunished? How many wealthy oligarchs that indulge in such depravity that not a court on the planet can prosecute? In fact, during the 2008 financial crisis, which was driven primarily because of fraud as a business model, one of the only people to have ever seen jail time was Jeffrey Madoff, and that's only because he ripped off other capitalists. The fact that the criminal justice system is slanted in such a way as to impose massive fines on criminals that they oftentimes cannot pay, as well as the fact that lawyers cost a fortune, the very act of criminalizing poverty and giving people with enough money an out to softer sentences if they pay their bribes and dues is a testimony to the fact that we live in a dictatorship of capital. It is a fairly well-known fact that the first police forces to emerge in bourgeois society came to be as a means to protect private property, as well as break up strikes and labor organizing. In Southern America, during the slavery era of the 17 and 1800s, the police acted as a means to protect the slave trade and catch runaway slaves as well. Sheriffs during this era functioned as slave patrols. To this day, the job of the police is not to protect and serve, but to enforce the law and protect private property. And not just the police, but the National Guard as well. The powers that be have demonstrated that they are not averse to signing off on orders to send the military to turn guns on their fellow countrymen. 3 examples of such repressions taking place include when college students at Kent State University were protesting the Vietnam War, and the National Guard opened fire on the crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 4 and injuring 9. Or the labor wars of Logan County, West Virginia in 1921, where some 10,000 United Mine Workers organized against the police, who were collaborating with strikebreakers against the protesters. The confrontation ultimately ended with the United States military intervening to break up the strike. Between 500 and 100 mine workers were killed during the battle, and nearly 1,000 more were arrested and jailed. Finally, during the Veterans March of April 1932, during the Great Depression, where 43,000 demonstrators marched on Washington demanding remuneration for entitlements that they were owed by the U.S. government in 1924, Washington panicked and signed off on rolling the tanks into Capitol, firing tear gas onto the crowd, brutally repressing the demonstration, jailing thousands and injuring thousands more. In each of these instances, working-class people were rising up to fight for their interests, be it to stop sending our young men to die in pointless wars of aggression, or for unionizing miners demanding workers' rights, or for war veterans collecting on entitlements owed to them by the U.S. government. Notice how the police and army are called upon almost immediately to crush the demonstrations and protect business as usual. The army and police are never there to fight on behalf of the people when they are there to supposedly protect and serve. And anecdote after anecdote has demonstrated this as the farce that it is. As of now, the police have grown increasingly militant, and the prison industrial complex has swollen in size. And now not only does the police and prisons exist to perpetuate capitalism, they also exist as a profitable venture in their own right for private prisons to lobby for harsher sentences for milder crimes, for the expansion of the police force, and the expansion of the prisons and surveillance state. And as for the deep state, that is, the FBI, the CIA, and these other alphabet soup institutions, the work that they do is overwhelmingly to protect the interests of the United States government. The deep state institutions engage in repression, both hard and soft. We shall discuss the forms of soft repression that they engage in a moment, but for now, let us discuss the type of hard repression that they engage in. The CIA routinely backs coups in Latin America, the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia, overthrowing sovereign governments and installing fascist dictators in their place who will gladly sell out their own people and their country's resources to the interests of the transnational bourgeoisie. The name of the game is simple. First, private consultants are sent to these countries, offering them predatory loans and infrastructure projects designed to ensnare these countries and shackle them with more debt than they can ever hope to pay off. And if they refuse, the CIA will pump money into reactionary opposition groups, arming them and giving them the resources that they need to coup the government. This isn't a conspiracy either, it's a well-documented historical fact. Just check out the lengthy Wikipedia article on the subject of United States involvement in regime change. The US deep state has been deliberately destabilizing countries for decades, starting with these predatory loans, and when that doesn't work, coup d'etat, and when that doesn't work, we look for provocations for war. We went to war with Korea and Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. We backed fascist dictators in Chile, Cuba, Iraq, Brazil, Greece, South Vietnam, South Korea, Indonesia, Bolivia, and many other places around the globe. We are currently involved in several active conflicts at this moment, from Libya to Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Somalia, northwest Pakistan, and Afghanistan. These conflicts are not only an extension of the hard repression by the dictatorship of capital, but the military-industrial complex as well, which has become a profitable venture in its own right, just like the prison-industrial complex has. The goal of this industry is to blow up countries, and then go and rebuild them. And all they have to do is move the goalpost and find excuse after excuse to endlessly occupy these countries, keeping the regions destabilized and antagonizing the locals into fighting us so that we have an excuse to stay and keep bombing them. Brilliant's tactic, but I digress. One could consider the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan hostile corporate takeovers of sovereign nations. To any Americans listening, since we as a people tend to have very short attention spans, today I shall remind you that Saddam Hussein was at one point our golden boy. The CIA helped Saddam take power in the 1980s because he agreed to serve our interests. It wasn't until he decided to nationalize his oil fields in the 1990s that he became a terrible, evil dictator that needed to be stopped. And the same goes for Gaddafi in Libya, Mossadegh in Iran, and Assad in Syria. In fact, come to think of it, I don't think there has been one country in the Middle East or North Africa that America hasn't invaded that hasn't nationalized its oil industry besides Saudi Arabia, and that's only because they're selling us that oil on the cheap. We'll get into the ideological justifications for these interventions in the segments to come. For now, all you need to know is something, we gotta protect our freedoms, something, if we don't fight them over there, then they're gonna cross the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean all the way on the other side of the planet to fight us over here, something 9/11, something Alamo. I digress, let's move on. In this section, we are going to discuss the passive ways in which bourgeois hegemony is enforced, and this comes in the form of the political apparatus as well as the secondary role of the deep state. As mentioned prior, the deep state serves a function both covert and overt, both passive and active. On one hand, giving resources to reactionary rebel groups in sovereign countries to overthrow democratically elected governments, and routinely assassinating populist leaders and labor union organizers in the Third World, while on the other hand waging a psy-war on the minds of the working class in the First World to see to it that we don't have a domestic Bolshevik revolution here in the imperial core. All one has to do is look at Operation COINTELPRO, where the FBI was poised with infiltrating left-wing activist groups and organizations with the intent to sow conflict, disarray, and balkanize said groups, tearing them apart and blunting their edge. Or in Operation Mockingbird, a large-scale psyop by the CIA to flood our media institutions with anti-communist propaganda, propping up narratives and stories of the horrors of communist governments, as well as paying writers like Robert Conquest to push narratives of famine, terror, and mass murder. Time and time again, the CIA has financed front organizations and think tanks to slander communist governments, downplaying their accomplishments and fabricating stories of brutality. The general populace may not realize it, but there is a reason to lie about the history of communism and demonize the Reds in every way imaginable. It's about controlling public discourse and dominating the mind. I believe Michael Parenti put it best in his book, Black Shirts and Reds. In the United States, for over 100 years, the ruling interests tirelessly propagated anti-communism among the populace, until it became more like a religious orthodoxy than a political analysis. During the Cold War, the anti-communist ideological framework could transform any data about existing communist societies into hostile evidence. If the Soviets refused to negotiate a point, they were intransigent and belligerent. If they appeared willing to make concessions, this was a skillful ploy to put us off our guard. By opposing arms limitations, they would have demonstrated their aggressive intent. But when in fact they supported most armaments treaties, it was because they were malicious and manipulative. If the churches in the USSR were empty, this demonstrated that religion was suppressed, but if the churches were full, this meant the people were rejecting the regime's atheistic ideology. If the workers went on strike, as rarely happened on infrequent occasions, this was evidence of their alienation from the collectivist system. If they didn't go on strike, this was because they were intimidated and lacked freedom. A scarcity of consumer goods demonstrated the failure of the economic system, and improvements in consumer supplies meant only that the leaders were attempting to placate a restive population and
also maintain a firmer hold over them. If communists in the United States played an important role in struggling for the rights of workers, the poor, African Americans, women, and others, this was only their guileful way of gathering support among the disenfranchised groups and gaining power for themselves. How one gained power by fighting for the rights of the powerless groups was never explained. What we are dealing with is a non-falsifiable orthodoxy, so assiduously marketed by the ruling interests that it affected people across the entire political spectrum. And then there's the role played by non-governmental organizations, or NGOs for short. NGOs are institutions independent of the government that are typically provided with private funding, sometimes state funding, comprised of citizen volunteers that have a mission statement or a goal in mind, be it human rights, environmentalism, war on poverty, etc. NGOs serve a unique role in the sense that they are typically tasked with harnessing populist fervor from the public, catching young activists with real genuine grievances and desires for social change under their wing, and integrating them within the confines of a legal organization that might do some good here and there, but in the grand scheme of things is largely ineffective and only seeks to tackle the symptoms of capitalism without actually addressing the systematic components that lead to these symptoms in the first place. NGOs are a diabolically effective way of co-opting revolutionary fervor and redirecting it into something that is tameable and manageable. All one has to do is look at the current Extinction Rebellion and its defanged tactics of inconveniencing the public, eschewing anti-capitalist sentiments, and collaboration with the police to see a golden example of this in the modern day. And now we shall bridge into the political apparatus. In a future video, I shall cover in detail why liberal democracy is designed not to work. At least not towards the material interests of the populist masses, but for now I will provide a summary as to why exactly that is. When the United States was founded, only white, property-owning men could vote, or roughly the top 10% of the population. Of course, suffrage has expanded to include the broader masses thanks to political struggle waged by the people over the years. Voting is largely a token, symbolic gesture, as candidates are pre-selected by the Republican and Democratic establishments, both of which, mind you, are private institutions and can nominate whomever they please as their championed candidates. Not to mention the enormous amounts of money required to run a political campaign, barricading the vast majority of the working class population from ever being viable. Not to mention the fact that presidential candidates that are elected are not legally obligated to uphold the promises that they may or may not have made on the campaign trails. The system is effectively fixed so that only those with money, and are willing to serve money, will ever have a chance of winning. And by extension, only those with money will ever have their interests represented. Let's talk about the Democratic establishment briefly. Progressives have been trying to infiltrate the Democrats for some time, trying to get a populist center-left social democratic candidate elected who will institute pro-worker policies from single-payer healthcare, a living wage, free college, affordable housing, and other concessions that the ruling class has historically conceded to placate the masses. The progressive sect of the Democratic Party, which has grown in recent years, represents that real populist fervor spoken of earlier. That hunger deep down that the first world proletariat has for a more fair, just, and equitable system. Progressives such as Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Tulsi Gabbard, the Squad, and other so-called Justice Democrats function as a kind of sheep herders, funneling populist sentiments back into the hegemony of the two-party duopoly. It's the reason why Bernie Sanders never called out the blatant electoral fraud that circumvented his wins in 2016 and 2020, and also why on both occasions he endorsed the neoliberal candidates Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. Since Americans have short attention spans, let me remind you once again that Social Democrats have been trying the reformist strategy for a very long time to no avail, be it Jesse Jackson in the 1980s and 90s, or Wayne Morse in the 1960s for that matter. Every attempt to take the Democratic Party in a more progressive direction has failed, and the only time that it's ever worked historically was in the 1930s during the Great Depression under FDR, when he was trying to circumvent a socialist uprising with his concessions. In fact, one of FDR's crowning achievements during this time, which he bragged about personally, was the fact that he effectively saved capitalism. We need to discuss the final components of passive repression.
We have covered slander and fabrications by think tanks funded by the deep state, the way that NGOs and the Democratic Party take the seeds of populism and co-opt it, bringing it into the control of the establishment, and now we shall discuss censorship and deplatforming. Historically, the United States has a long history of unleashing terror and repression on the far left. There was a period of time in this country where you could lose your job, or be deported, or even go to jail for being an open socialist or communist. I shall now play a brief clip from Abby Martin's Empire Files episode on the War on Communism, summarizing domestic white terror here in the United States. The following clip demonstrates an example of what soft and hard repression combined looks like.
On November 7th, 1919, a date chosen to mark the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, a series of violent raids, without warrants, took place in 12 American cities, arresting hundreds. Months later, on January 2nd, raids took place in more than 30 cities involving federal, state, and local law enforcement. Every single socialist office was raided. Homes of socialists were also raided. Around 10,000 people were rounded up and thrown in jail in Palmer and Hoover's raids. Thousands of resident immigrants were deported for being communists. The raids became notorious for their extreme brutality. Such a massive operation dealt a huge blow to the socialist movement, and was a clear message of terror to anyone who considered joining a socialist group. Similar state-sanctioned violent repression of socialists continued in the following years. Police departments formed official Red Squads, where police intelligence units working with business elites unleashed terror on party members. They conducted mass surveillance, raided their meetings, and ransacked their offices. The era of anti-communism that followed World War II was fierce. In 1946, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act. It was an unprecedented purge of socialist union members, of which there were many. Up until this point, half of the unions in America were under the leadership of socialists. But with the new law, every single union officer was required to sign an affidavit, pledging that they did not believe in socialism. If you didn't sign, you lost your job. Knowing that art could dangerously convey ideas, the government wanted to have tight control over that too. In 1947, the House Committee on Un-American Activities began to target people in the entertainment industry. Dangerous professions such as screenwriters, actors, directors, producers, technicians, authors, musicians, and others were all summoned to Congress and forced to publicly swear that they were not communist. Those who said they were barred from employment and blacklisted in Hollywood. But you didn't even have to say you were to get punished. You just had to assert your rights. Like the 10 screenwriters and directors who took a stand against the nationwide witch hunt. All 10 decided that when asked if they were communist, they would refuse to answer. All 10 were sent to prison. For those who were open communists, well, they were just arrested. Under the Smith Act, it was deemed illegal for anyone to be a member of the Communist Party. And in a surprise attack, the state arrested everyone who held a leadership position in the party. All of them were sent to prison. Over 100 were convicted of being communists and given sentences of up to 6 years, jailed for nothing but their beliefs. During this period, 5,000 communists were forced to flee the country. More than 1,000 went to prison. The climate was such that anyone who even leaned to the left was completely persecuted. But just to show how far it would take things in the legal system, the US government went beyond hard prison sentences. In 1951, Communist Party members Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were found guilty of being spies. But their sentences would be much different than their predecessors. The judge convicted them not for espionage, but for the murder of all the American soldiers who had been sent to die in Korea. On June 19, 1953, they were executed. The vicious anti-communism of the 40s and 50s effectively snuffed out the left in the big cities, where the movement had always been strong. Finally, the plutocrats felt safe from the pitchforks. But a challenge to the system's white supremacy suddenly reared its head in the rural South. In Montgomery, Alabama, a new mass movement was born. The state used its weapons of red baiting, violence, and imprisonment, waging an all-out assault on those who wouldn't accept the status quo. The government's offensive with COINTELPRO was devastating. It targeted all socialist organizations and black liberation groups. It worked to put spies in every single black student union and every college. Tens of thousands had their homes ransacked by the FBI. Through this mass surveillance operation, the government used a wrecking ball of infiltration, sabotage, and even assassinations.
In summary, censorship and deplatforming are effective tools to thought police the masses and make sure that the proles don't get any radical ideas like
building a society free of parasites. This is the reason why the mainstream media straight up doesn't talk about how deeply intertwined money and politics actually are, why the United States is always invading countries, or any of the dirty, underhanded bills that get passed that hose the American people. Don't talk about any of the problems, and when things do get brought up, it must be presented through the pre-filtered lens of the bias of the US media. Scandals are censored, covered up, and the whistleblowers that do bring these things to light, that is, the Snowdens, the Assanges, and Mannings of the world, are now either wanted fugitives or are imprisoned, tortured, and made an example of. Alternatively, when you do have political dissidents that point out the brutality of the United States or any of the scandals or problems that plague this country, or even have the balls to point out how capitalism is the root of all evil, it always comes from the voices that are more than willing to denounce the successful revolutions and have been in favor of the right movements when it was politically convenient to do so. Examples of such controlled opposition include the likes of George Orwell, Noam Chomsky, and Chris Hedges, or voices that are allowed to criticize the empire, but only if they don't present any viable alternatives, don't speak a peep of revolutionary politics, and are willing to denounce the other side and bash them as being just as bad, if not worse, as the United States. In other words, the only left-wing thought that is oftentimes tolerated is left-wing thought from anti-communists. So in this regard, is it really a wonder that these men are all Soviet bashers and stand in opposition to the global communist movement? Think about the moral of the story of the likes of books like Animal Farm, where the overarching theme is that, yeah, the current system sucks, but don't attempt a new system, otherwise it will end in disaster and result in something worse than we already have. So be happy with what you got, don't try to change anything. In summary, passive repression takes the form of historical fabrication, slander, censorship, cover-ups, co-opting populism, and controlled opposition.
Next, we have arrived at cultural hegemony, or the dominant zeitgeist of capitalist political economy. In feudalism, the barons, lords, and aristocrats own the land upon which the peasantry reside. In peasant economies, handicraftsmen produce goods either for personal consumption, barter, or for the consumption of the ruling class. The surplus they produce for the rentier class is known as rent, and if they don't pay their rent, most likely a man in metal armor will be ready to pay the peasantry a visit and force them to pay their keep. Unlike bourgeois economics, the exploitation in peasant economies is not obfuscated by the buying and selling of labor power, and instead takes a more raw and naked form in the way of rents. So out from feudal society, a form of ideological justification emerges to help perpetuate the system. And what better way to justify exploitative and amoral behavior against your neighbors than organized religion? The clergy historically have acted as the ideological apparatus of the superstructure to legitimize the rentier class's rule. The king has royal blood, holy blood. He is the Superman, and is preordained by God to rule. I must say, though, that the ingenuity of the human mind is incredible, for organized religion is arguably one of the greatest spooks ever conjured by man. For to this day, hundreds of years after the scientific revolution, 84% of the population remains convinced in the equivalent of a genie. On the other hand, there's capitalism, where labor is socialized and the extortion of surplus value takes a more hidden form. Elements from feudalism still exist within capitalism, of course, but the ideological justification for this exploitation has taken a new form in the way of liberal ideology. Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci discusses the inner workings of liberal ideology extensively. Gramsci's theory of hegemony goes something like this. The dominant ideology of the day is designed to perpetuate the ruling class. The masses are indoctrinated with it. In other words, capitalism has colonized our minds. If you're a leftist and you've had a conversation with your peers about the problems in the world, and you've pointed out how they are related to capitalism and how we need a new system, I want to know how many times you have heard apologetics along the lines of,
"Well, they earned it. They started the business, they thought of the idea, they took the risk, it's their money."
"Well, if you don't like it, then why don't you just start your own business and get rich yourself?"
"The poor are just lazy and stupid. It is clearly their fault. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps if they want to make something of themselves." "Well, there is no free lunch. You gotta work for it if you want it."
Well, if you don't like Mega Corporation X that rapes and pillages the earth, why don't you just vote with your wallet and buy from somebody else? Well, here you are complaining about capitalism, but here you are wearing a t-shirt made by capitalism.
In each of these instances, the people saying these things, most of the time unconsciously, are conjuring any and all forms of sophistry to justify the cruelty and inhumanity and barbarism of the current order. Liberalism has become the new ideological hegemon of society, and its clergy at large include celebrities, economists, politicians, self-help gurus, news anchors, radio talk show hosts, conservative think tanks, all of whom receive a steady supply of cash from the powers that be to peddle the grift.
This past weekend, hundreds of thousands of people utilised one of capitalism's greatest achievements, the smartphone, to send the hashtag #ResistCapitalism trending worldwide on Twitter. Mom's basement dwelling communists. If you actually did resist capitalism with any degree of success, the following would not exist. Twitter, the iPhone you're tweeting hashtag #ResistCapitalism from, the internet.
No, Taylor. I'm not taking pie from you. I'm giving pie to me. You see, I didn't have any pie, so I gave pie to me. Now, I don't have any pie, so I'm not taking pie from you. I'm giving pie to me.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests.
Well, you can call it what you want, but, you know, I come from a background where I feel that the average person, normal people, work for a living. They don't, live off the government's back. They don't live off anybody's back. They have pride. They stand out on their own 2 feet. If a person chooses not to work, that's fine. But don't go and collect benefits because you're too lazy to get up out of bed. I have to wake up for work at 4:30 a.m. in the morning, get my ass out of bed into the freezing cold because I have pride. And yet I pay taxes so some slob can sit in bed watching cartoons while I'm not cleaning up for them.
What does competition mean? In Latin, it means to conspire together. So how do you conspire by competing? Well, if you and I are going to play a sport, and I'm a pretty big guy, if we're going to play basketball, I'm going to push you as hard as I possibly can. By doing that, you're going to get better. I want you to push me as hard as you can. I want to get better. By competing, we conspire to make each other better. And I think so many people think of competition as just pure win-lose, and they don't understand the larger game that happens that comes from it when it's done intelligently. Now, some people are abusive in anything, business, sports, economics. I understand that. But boy, we've seen so much transformation in the quality of life of human beings because of that competition. And if you look at systems around the world, communism being one of those, you hear a lot of kids today talking about socialism's the answer. They've never been in one. I'm old enough to have been there. I went to the USSR when it was still the Soviet Union and made me a capitalist. I remember people standing in line for bread around the block. And then I got on a train where everything's supposed to be equal, and I was with a group of scientists. I was invited there to go on. And we had caviar in first class. I mean, your idea of socialism is because you've never been there. It's just not true. And it's our fault, though, because we haven't taught our youth to really be capitalists. But if you decide to work harder on yourself than anything else, if you can find a way to do more for others than anybody else does in your category, then you won't just make money. You just won't have a great job or a great business. You'll have a meaningful life. And it's one of the most important pieces of advice I was ever given.
50 million, but what you're forgetting is if I make 100 million, I had to create a lot of jobs to make that money. That's the point. When the capitalist is making money,
there's a thing called greed, and the problem with
well, we're all greedy. Everybody.
No, we're not. Well, you cannot say that we're all greedy. You cannot.
Well, don't you want things
greedy.
for yourself? You don't want more. You don't want better things for yourself.
We
Better life?
all do, and that's the problem.
What?
We, or some of us, are simple people. We just want a place to live. We just want some food in our refrigerator.
And
We
capitalism,
just want to take care of our kids.
capitalism is the best way to get those things.
These are the voices that you will most commonly hear on TV, the voices that push the rugged liberal individualism and endless pursuit of self-enrichment. Notice that it's only the most powerful ones that get to speak their thoughts. You will never hear about all of the people who gave it their all but never made it and became successful, which constitutes the vast majority of the population. Instead, the only voices that are ever brought on are the handful that were fortunate enough to succeed, or born in a position where they were able to succeed, and by design have a survivor bias. And the narrative that they push is all the same. The narrative that it is every man for himself and that nobody's ever going to help you in life. So all you can do is take care of yourself and serve yourself. And those rich people that are hoarding most of the money deserve it because they gave you the privilege to be exploited and make them more money. And that we shouldn't have a society designed around taking care of people. We shouldn't have a society that actually cares about your well-being or actively works to solve the problems of poverty, climate change, and a lack of democracy. Instead, poverty is externalized and treated as a moral failing on the part of the individual, while the wealthy and powerful are adulated and their crimes against humanity are swept under the rug.
And since the powers that be, who own and control the military, the police state, the political machine, and the deep state also control the media apparatuses, you are always going to get news from a highly biased and pre-filtered narrative that always tells you the story from the side of the bourgeois. In addition to having all of the money and power, it logically concludes that they also have all of the money left over to invest in movies, books, TV shows, advertising, comic books, cartoons, and other various assortments of media, oftentimes watering down the deeper artistic vision that many of these mediums have for the sake of appealing to the lowest common denominator and maximizing profits. You will very rarely, if ever, find any media that explores far-left philosophy or portrays communism in a positive or even objective light, and this isn't by accident. For one, complex philosophical topics are difficult for the layman to grasp and require a greater deal of time invested into the medium to immerse oneself, and two, if I'm the owner of a movie or cartoon company, why would I want to pay some people to write a movie or a show that portrays me or the system that I benefit from in a negative light? In the same way that religion served as the culturally hegemonic zeitgeist under feudalism, liberalism is the culturally hegemonic zeitgeist under capitalism. In the same way that it became common sense to people in the dystopic future of idiocracy that Brondo is good for you and that drinking water is gross,
excuse me. I think this might be Gatorade or something. I was just looking for some regular water.
Water?
Yeah.
You mean like in the toilet? What for?
No, just to drink.
people have become conditioned to believe that individualistic, self-serving behavior at the expense of others is a virtue, and to systematically plan for the greater good to the benefit of everyone always turns out in disaster.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
At last we arrive at material hegemony, or the fact that the means of production, the factories, the farms, the tools, the land, the resources, in other words, the things that we use to produce the things that we have grown to depend upon on a daily basis, are all privately owned. This is at the very core of why the vast majority of humanity doesn't rebel and instead continues to choose to submit to the global capitalist machine. It is not just because they have monopolistic control over the violence of the state, or the political machines, or even the media machines. It is the raw materials and resources or means of production itself that we need to survive. We must submit to labor for income so that we may purchase means of subsistence or continue to persist in this world. If we withdraw our labor or support for the machine, without an alternative, we will go destitute.
we shall cease to be. In other words, work or starve. And this goes for the cops beating down crowds of protesters, as well as the drone pilots in the military, the service workers who distribute the goods, the factory workers who make the goods, the managers who keep the grunts in line, etc. None of them are doing this for free. Some way or another, we have to submit to the machine. We have to take on a role to keep it going, because our lives are dependent upon participating in society, no matter how much we may like it or not. This is why voting with your dollar doesn't work, because the general masses will take the convenience of the goods and services that corporations have to provide over some vague promise of a more just and egalitarian world. At the end of the day, as long as the system is able to meet people's needs and provide a non-stop supply of hits of dopamine at gas station levels of convenience, in general it is safe to assume that people won't rebel. Not to mention the advent of the first world labor aristocracy, where the net benefactors of the empire include a sect of the global proletariat within the domestic borders of the imperial core. From social safety nets to entitlements to cheap consumerist crap that we can afford on a dime at Walmart, the first world masses have effectively been placated and disconnected from the global class struggle. If you'd like to learn more about the global class divide or the labor aristocracy, I highly recommend the work Imperialism in the 21st Century by John Smith. Out of all of the forms of control, material hegemony is the most critical, which is the reason why when this system fails to provide means of subsistence, like clockwork, you will see the masses develop spontaneous class consciousness practically overnight, and why it is usually in moments of severe crisis and instability that you see the rise of genuine revolutionary fervor. This fervor has had two natures historically, that is, socialist progression or fascist reaction. Tragically, due to the decades of brainwashing, as well as the living standards afforded by imperialism, history has shown that the first world proletariat is extremely vulnerable to fascism in times of crisis. And this is the reason why we need a well-disciplined, well-organized worker vanguard to lead the charge on the revolution here in the First World, building those institutions of dual power, providing people with alternatives, and developing a counter-hegemony within the heart of the imperial core. Unfortunately, the modern-day left in the First World has a number of obstacles and shortcomings that hinders and limits its advocacy, and unless these hiccups are overcome, we aren't going to get anywhere politically and the left will remain stuck in the mud. I shall now summarize my criticisms of the First World left. For one, there are a number of tendencies that reaffirm the capitalist system and engender the liberal mindset. These tendencies include social democracy, market socialism, and most strains of anarchism. I have done multiple videos discussing why social democracy doesn't work, and I have done one video on the topic of market socialism, and while I have a great deal to say about anarchism as a tendency, here's what I will say about these rightist deviations at the moment. Social democracy presupposes that the classes can live in harmony, and that we can regulate capitalism for the best possible outcome. Not computing that social democracy was only practical in an era of the post-World War II boom, when the rate of profits were restored and capitalism as a system was renewed. When profitability began to crash again, neoliberalism was instituted to rescue the system, a second time, from its own limits and shortcomings. Market socialism engenders capitalism because all of the mechanisms and components of the capitalist system are left intact. And anarchism, as a tendency, tends to lack cohesion, central authority, a sound theoretical base, and due to its decentral nature, is highly vulnerable to infiltration and sabotage, which is why historically they have only been able to capture small plots of land and only hold out for a couple years at a time before inevitably being crushed by a larger, more centralized, more well-organized force. In each case, these are right-wing deviations because they are derived from a great deal of liberal presuppositions about free trade and individualism, and don't address the mechanisms that make capitalism what it is in the first place, from falling profits to economic crashes to the consolidation of wealth and power into the hands of a few, etc. In summary, we have to uphold Marx's original scientific arguments as outlined in his works almost 2 centuries ago against not just capitalism, but free market capitalism. And we have to argue for an economy organized according to a plan. Secondly, there are tendencies that reaffirm anti-communism and reinforce CIA and liberal propaganda about actually existing socialism and the global workers' movement. Which is not to say that everybody who does this is controlled opposition. There is, however, a tendency for most of the vocal and popular figures on the left
to also be anti-communists. As long as the liberal narrative on actually existing socialism continues to prevail, as long as left-wingers continue to look at their own history without a scientific lens, the left will remain kneecapped, and in this regard, the right wing will continue to use this point as a bludgeon to hit us upside the head with. Nothing defangs reactionaries quicker and puts left-wingers on the winning side of an argument faster than when you cite books, accredited historians, and scientific research that directly refutes their anti-communist nonsense. One such example of this is a study that I have referenced in the past, directly comparing dozens of capitalist countries to dozens of socialist countries, and showing that when compared to their socialist counterparts, from economic developments to life expectancy to infant mortality, years of education, and GDP per capita, the socialist countries have provided consistently better living standards than their capitalist counterparts. Thirdly, there are some tendencies on the left, at least here in America, that reaffirm Western chauvinism and imperialist propaganda, and as a result, end up agreeing with the US or Western military interventions in foreign affairs or the economic sabotage of other countries. The consequences virtually always lead to the deaths and immiseration of millions of innocent people and the destabilization of entire world regions, such as when the anti-communist left was behind the toppling of the USSR and the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet republics, an event, mind you, that led to the premature deaths, impoverishments, and immiseration of untold millions of people. Or the unilateral bombing of Yugoslavia, leading up to the country's balkanization and current train wreck of a geopolitical situation. Or the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya, which led to the whole country turning into a failed state with open slave markets and warlordism every couple of miles, or the current drumroll for the toppling of Assad in Syria, or intervention in the DPRK, or standing in solidarity with the attempted color revolution that was going on in Hong Kong last year. To back any of these causes has always led to disastrous consequences that leave whole regions in ruin. And then to turn around and admit that it was a bad idea, but I'm behind the US empire's actions now because this time it will be different, is an unbelievably naive take. These countries all have their problems. However, imperialism has and never will liberate or uplift the people around the world, and has always worked to do the opposite of that. We have a duty as the first world proletariat to oppose and frustrate imperialism whenever and wherever we can. Finally, the biggest issue of them all, as far as I can tell, is the lack of solidarity, not only among the masses but between other left-wingers as well. The sheer amounts of infighting and purity testing and lack of effective organizing that goes on in left-wing circles is truly disheartening. Organizations are constantly splitting over minor disagreements, many fall into the trap of book worship and become mired in dogmatism, others engage in witch hunting, looking to call out any and all behavior of their peers that may or may not seem problematic. Needless to say, there is something about gaining an increased depth of understanding about social issues and political economy that drives many on the left to develop a severe case of unwarranted self-importance. And not only is the left divided amongst itself, it is also largely removed from the masses. And to be fair, this is largely the fault of capitalism. The burden still falls on us to awaken the latent class consciousness of the masses and guide them towards socialism. And while we should hold book clubs and have readings, we need to engage in forms of struggle that involves bringing people into the fray. And when the capitalist system falls apart and the masses fall prey to fascism, we will have nobody but ourselves to blame. So in conclusion, capitalism is propped up and perpetuated by the hegemony that has emerged from it, and thus it logically follows that the modern left needs to concentrate on building a counter-hegemony to challenge the status quo. In the future, I will write a more detailed essay on this topic, as well as providing examples of effective praxis utilized by revolutionary movements, and explain how exactly to go about building counter-hegemony. For now, I feel a summary is in order. We need a material counter-hegemony to the status quo's material hegemony. What this means is mutual aid and serve the people programs, community gardens, localized gift economies, backyard labs for synthesizing our own generics to undercut big pharma, and think tanks for utilizing technology to provide a better alternative to what capitalism has to offer. By weaning people off of the material dependence on the system, we draw them into our cause and bring the masses to us. If we provide an alternative, they will come.
We need to become more than theory experts. We also need to develop practical skills to make this counter-hegemony a reality. We need to learn science, skills, trades, and talents that are useful and practical in the real world. We also need a counterculture. This means our own music, movies, artwork, propaganda, and video games that promote and instill socialist values and philosophy into the public sphere. This will get people thinking and make them more sympathetic to our ideas. Once we start to draw in more attention, we will be able to build critical mass and construct institutions of dual power. That is, setting up communes, workers' councils, militias, and human services, allowing people to act even more free and independent of capitalism. This is important because these institutions of dual power will go on to form the new organs of the state after the revolution. Eventually, through the building of our own counter-hegemony, with enough built-up critical mass and having enough people on our side, we can begin seizing control of factories and farms, occupying buildings, eventually going on to take over entire cities, and continuing to build working-class power in preparation for the final confrontation with the capitalist class. I will not try to deny that this final confrontation will not be peaceful, since historically the ruling class has never given up their power, wealth, and influence peacefully. But with the people united and ready to realize their destiny, we will finally be able to relegate the capitalist system to the dustbin of history and establish a new, humane communist society. Only then will humanity finally liberate itself from the shackles of reaction and take destiny into our own hands, marking the end of prehistory and the dawn of civilized society. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks for tuning in.